The emergency session of the Galactic Defense Coalition had been running for 6 hours straight, and Commander Vexler could feel his crystalline exoskeleton aching from the tension in the chamber. Holographic display at the center of the Grand Hall showed the same devastating truth that had brought them all here. 12 sectors lost in 18 months, and the Kravax swarm showed no signs of slowing down. Vexler watched as council member after council member presented their reports, and each one painted a grimmer picture than the last. The Antharian fleets had been decimated at the Battle of Proxima Drift. Sulfari defensive lines had collapsed within days of contact. Even the legendary Veltorian warriors with their six-limbed combat prowess had been forced into full retreat after losing 3 entire battle groups. We are losing this war, High Chancellor Mordock announced, and his 3 voices harmonized in a tone that conveyed absolute certainty. Chamber fell silent because everyone knew it was true. Traditional military doctrine had failed against the Kravax, their hive mind. Coordination allowed them to execute maneuvers that no individual species could counter. They attacked simultaneously from multiple vectors and adapted to defensive strategies. Within hours, coalition forces fought with honor and precision and discipline. But the Kravax fought with something else entirely: an absolute disregard for individual survival and a collective intelligence that learned from every engagement. There is one proposal we have not yet considered, Ambassador Tleth said, and her voice carried a note of hesitation that made several delegates lean forward. The humans have offered their military forces to aid our cause. The reaction was immediate, and loud. A dozen species began speaking at once, and their translation matrices struggling to keep up with the overlapping objections. Deathworlders? Someone shouted, "Have you seen their homeworld classification?" Another delegate demanded Class 7 environmental hazard rating means their planet is actively trying to kill them at all times. They evolved alongside apex predators that hunted in packs. Their own historical records show they spent millennia at war with themselves. This is madness. Vexler had read the reports on humanity, and he understood the Concern Earth was a nightmare world by galactic standards, with crushing gravity and wildly fluctuating temperatures and atmospheric conditions that ranged from life-sustaining to lethal depending on location. The species that evolved there had to be either incredibly resilient or incredibly lucky, and humans appeared to be both. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The humans claim their military can provide what we lack. Ambassador Tweth continued once the chamber quieted down. They have submitted preliminary data on their combat capabilities and tactical doctrines. The holographic display shifted to show human soldiers in various combat scenarios. Vexler studied the images with his 4 optical sensors, taking in every detail. Humans were bipedal like many species, but there was something in their posture and in the way they moved that set his instincts on edge. They looked like predators. Their physical capabilities are impressive for Deathworlders. Tleth admitted enhanced endurance from high-gravity evolution and redundant organ systems and a remarkable tolerance for injury, but their psychological profile is what concerns me most. Another series of images appeared showing human conflicts. Throughout their history, they have been at war almost continuously for their entire recorded civilization, and they have developed weapons specifically designed to kill others. Of their own species with maximum efficiency, they possess something they call tactical aggression, which appears to be the ability to channel violence in controlled bursts while maintaining strategic thinking. High Chancellor Mordock raised one of his primary appendages, and the chamber fell silent again. We are not in a position to be selective about our allies, and the Kravax will not stop their advance while we debate the philosophical implications of accepting help from Deathworlders. I propose we send an observation team to evaluate human military capabilities firsthand, and if they prove suitable, we integrate their forces into our defensive operations. The vote was called, and despite the obvious reservations, the motion passed. Coalition needed help, and the humans were offering it. Vexler found himself assigned to lead the observation team, which felt like either a great honor or a career-ending punishment. He suspected it was the latter. 3 cycles later, Vexler stood in the briefing room of the Coalition flagship with his newly assembled team around him. Sub-Commander Tren was a Sulfari, tactical genius whose methane-based biology required a specialized environmental suit at all times, battle mistress. Quikia represented the Veltorian warrior caste, and her 6 limbs carried weapons that had seen action in 43 major engagements. Tactical analyst Zephyrim was a Quellan, and his species possessed the most advanced pattern recognition abilities in known space. Our mission is straightforward, Vexler explained while pulling up the star charts. We will travel to the Titan facility where humans conduct their military training, and we will observe their methods and evaluate their combat readiness and determine if they can contribute meaningfully to our war effort, and if they cannot, Quasia asked, and her translator conveying both curiosity and skepticism. Then we report that to the Council, and they will politely decline the human offer of assistance. Tren S. Environmental Suit hissed as he adjusted his breathing mixture. I have reviewed the preliminary data on human physiology, and I must admit, I am concerned about their stability in Deathworld. Species are known for unpredictable behavior patterns. Zephyrim nodded in agreement, and his large eyes blinking slowly. The statistical models suggest humans may be too aggressive for integrated operations, and their D is a 73% probability they will cause more chaos than combat effectiveness. Vexler understood their concerns because he shared them, but orders were orders, and the coalition was desperate. We depart in 6 hours, and I suggest you all review the cultural briefings on humanity because their social customs are quite different from what we are accustomed to. The journey to Titan took 4 days through jump space, and Vexler spent most of that time reading everything he could find about humans there. History was a catalog of conflicts and innovations, and survival against impossible odds. They had clawed their way up from prey animals to apex predators, and then built civilizations, and then nearly destroyed those civilizations multiple times, and then built them again. They had split the atom and walked on their own moon and created artificial intelligence, and all while still fighting wars among themselves. It was simultaneously impressive and terrifying. The ship finally dropped out of jump space near Saturn. Vexler got his first look at human space infrastructure. Titan was covered in military installations and orbital platforms and ships of various designs. Everything was functional and efficient, with none of the aesthetic considerations that most civilized species incorporated into their architecture they build for war. Quisha observed, and her tone carrying a note of respect. Everything here serves a military purpose. The shuttle descended through Titan's thick atmosphere and touched down at camp Mackenzie, which according to the briefing materials was a standard human training facility. Vexler and his team disembarked and immediately noticed the gravity was 0.85 standard, which meant Titan had been partially terraformed to match Earth's crushing gravitational pull. A human was waiting for them at the landing pad. She was short by human standards, but carried herself with an air of absolute authority. Scars crisscrossed her exposed forearms, and her dark eyes assessed the alien delegation with the same intensity that Vexler was using to assess her commander. Vexler, I presume, she said, and her voice was rough but clear. I am Sergeant Major Maria Santos, and I will be your liaison during your stay here, and welcome to Camp Mackenzie. She smiled, and Vexler noticed her teeth. They were flat mostly, but the canines were just pointed enough to remind him that humans were evolved persistence hunters. We are honored to be here, Vexler replied while trying to keep his translation matrix steady. We are eager to observe your training methods, Santos nodded and gestured toward a nearby building. Then let us get started, because basic training cycle began this morning. The recruits are currently on their 3rd hour of conditioning basic training. Tren asked. Yes, this is where we take civilians and turn them into soldiers, and it takes 12 weeks, and every human in our military goes through it. Vexler felt a small sense of relief. If this was basic entry-level training, then surely it would not be as intense as what elite coalition forces underwent. That relief would not last long. Sergeant Major Santos led the alien delegation through Camp Mackenzie, and Vexler tried to take in every detail of the human training facility. Buildings were utilitarian structures made from reinforced concrete and metal with no decorative elements whatsoever. Everything was painted in dull colors that Santos explained were meant to be psychologically neutral, though Vexler was not sure what that meant. The first thing he noticed was the sound haven. From a distance he could hear rhythmic shouting and the pounding of feet on pavement and voices yelling commands in harsh tones. That is Third Company running their morning 5-kilometer. Santos explained while pointing toward a group of humans moving in formation along a distant road 5 kilometers. Leisha asked in her translator, struggling with the conversion in this gravity. Yes, they do it every morning before breakfast. And later, in their training cycle, they will do it with full combat gear, which adds about 30 kilograms to their body weight. Zephyrim quickly calculated the numbers, and his large eyes widened. That would be equivalent to a Veltorian carrying another full-grown Veltorian while running, and that is impossible. Santos smiled, and it was not a particularly comforting expression. We will find that humans have a different definition of impossible than most species. She led them to an observation. A platform that overlooked a large open area filled with various obstacles and structures below them, approximately 200 human recruits were assembled in neat formations. They all wore identical uniforms and their hair was cut short in a way that made them look almost identical from a distance. These recruits are in week 7 of basic training. Santos explained they have already completed basic physical conditioning and weapons familiarization, and they are now moving into advanced combat scenarios. A human in a different uniform began shouting orders, and the recruits immediately broke formation and ran toward what Santos called an obstacle course. Exler watched in growing concern as the humans began climbing over walls that were 3 times their height and crawling under barbed wire and swinging across gaps using only ropes. This seems dangerous. Tren observed injuries must be common. About 15% of recruits sustained some form of injury during basic training. Santos replied casually, mostly sprains and stress fractures and minor lacerations. 15%. Not keep the shock from his voice. That would be considered unacceptable in any coalition training program. We consider it acceptable losses for proper preparation. Santos said a soldier who cannot handle the stress of training will not survive combat. The aliens watched as one recruit fell from an obstacle and landed hard on the ground. The human lay there for a moment, then got up and immediately began climbing. Again, should someone not check if that individual is injured? Quecha asked if he cannot continue, he will signal for medical assistance. Santos explained, but we expect our soldiers to push through pain and discomfort, because the enemy will not stop attacking just because you hurt. Vexler realized with growing horror that the humans were not training soldiers in the traditional sense. They were conditioning their people to ignore their own survival instincts. The obstacle course took 30 minutes to complete, and by the end, most of the recruits were covered in mud and sweat, and several were bleeding from minor cuts. None of them complained. Next is hand-to-hand combat training, Santos announced while leading the delegation to another area. This section of the training ground featured padded mats and several humans in different uniforms, demonstrating techniques. We teach basic combatives to all soldiers. Santos explained the assumption is that ammunition will eventually run out or weapons will fail, and when that happens, you must be able to fight with your bare hands. What followed made Vexler's optical sensors dim in distress. The human instructors were demonstrating techniques that looked less like martial arts and more like systematic methods of causing maximum damage to another living being. Joint locks that would snap bones if applied with full force strikes to vulnerable areas like the throat and eyes, and nerve clusters. Grappling maneuvers designed to choke opponents into unconsciousness. Is this not attempted murder? Zephyrim whispered in his pattern recognition processors, struggling to categorize what he was witnessing. This is basic self-defense. Santos corrected. Our special forces learn much more advanced techniques. The recruits paired off and began practicing the techniques on each other. The sound of bodies hitting the mats echoed across the training ground. Occasionally someone would tap out and their partner would immediately release them, but the intensity never diminished. They are attacking each other, Quecha stated, and her 6 limbs twitching in agitation. Yes, controlled aggression is an important part of combat training, Santos replied. We need soldiers who can switch from peaceful to violent in an instant, and then switch back just as quickly. Tren est. Environmental suit hissed more frequently now, which Exler recognized as a sign of extreme stress in Sulfari biology. How many of your recruits suffer psychological damage from this conditioning? He asked. Santos considered the question carefully. About 5% washout due to psychological unsuitability. But those who complete the program are mentally resilient enough for combat operations. 5%. Vexler repeated, "You find this acceptable?" "War is not acceptable, Commander, but it happens anyway. And we prefer to send soldiers who have been properly prepared, rather than civilians who will break it the first." Sign of real violence. The afternoon brought even more disturbing revelations. The delegation watched as recruits were exposed to tear gas in a sealed chamber and forced to remove their protective masks while inside. This trains them to function in chemical warfare environments. Santos explained. Over the sounds of coughing and choking, they need to experience the sensation in a controlled setting, so they will not panic in actual combat. "You are deliberately poisoning them," Quisha said, and her translator barely managing to convey her species' expression of horror. "We are training them to survive poisoning." Santos corrected, "There is a difference." Next came live fire exercises where recruits had to advance toward objectives while actual bullets were fired over their heads. Rounds passed within inches of the crawling humans and kicked up dirt all around them. One mistake and they could be killed. Zephyrim calculated the margin for error as 0.03 meters. Yes. Santos agreed, that is the point, and they need to learn to stay calm under fire, and a training exercise with no real danger teaches them nothing useful. Vexler watched a recruit freeze in fear halfway through the course. The human drill instructor immediately began shouting at the terrified individual, and the words were harsh and brutal and designed to provoke movement through shame and anger. The recruit started crawling again. "Your training methods rely heavily on psychological stress." Vexler observed, "Yes, we break them down and then build them back up stronger." Santos said, "A soldier needs to know they can survive the worst day of their life and keep fighting." As the sun set over Titan, the delegation gathered in their assigned quarters to discuss what they had witnessed. "This is insane," Trent stated flatly. "They are torturing their own people and calling it training. The injury rates alone would cause riots in any civilized society," Quisha added, "and the psychological conditioning borders on brainwashing." Zephyrim pulled up statistical models on his datapad. "If we extrapolate from what we observed today, a full basic training cycle likely produces approximately 30% casualties when accounting for injuries and psychological washouts and medical discharges, and they call this basic training," Vexler said quietly. Santos mentioned that specialized forces undergo even more intensive preparation. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "We need to see more." Vexler finally decided one day of observation is not sufficient for a full report, and tomorrow we will ask to see advanced training scenarios that night. Vexler could not enter proper rest cycle mode. His mind kept replaying images of humans deliberately exposing themselves to pain and danger and violence. They trained like they were already at war with themselves. The terrifying part was that it seemed to work. Every recruit who made it through an obstacle or survived the gas chamber or crawled successfully under live fire came out the other side more confident and more capable and more dangerous. The next morning, Santos met them with the same unsettling smile. "I hope you all rested well, because today we are observing advanced tactical exercises and live ammunition will be used, and I recommend staying behind the safety barriers at all times." Vexler and his team followed her to a vast training range that stretched for several kilometers. "Today, 3rd Company will be conducting a simulated assault on a fortified position," Santos explained. "They will be facing live opposition fire and realistic defensive obstacles and time-limited objectives. This sounds like actual combat." Tren said, "That is the idea, Subcommander, and we train as we fight." The exercise began with an artillery simulation that sent the recruits scrambling for cover. Then they had to advance across open ground while machine gun fire tore up the earth around them. The humans moved in coordinated groups and used suppressive fire and covering movements. Several recruits were hit by simulation rounds that marked them as casualties. Lay where they fell, playing dead while their comrades continued the assault. Outpost Tarses 9 was a mining colony on the edge of Coalition space, and when Vexler and his delegation arrived with Sergeant Major Santos. They found a fortified position that housed approximately 3,000 coalition personnel from a dozen different species. The human company that had just graduated from basic training was being integrated into the defensive structure under the command of Lieutenant James Okonkwo, who looked far too young to be leading soldiers into potential combat. Okonkwo. This is Commander Vexler of the observation team. Santos made the introductions. Commander, the lieutenant and his company will be taking over Defense Sector 7, Okonkwo saluted in the human military fashion. Honored to meet you, sir, and my people are ready to do their part. Vexler studied the young human officer. You graduated from basic training only 2 weeks ago.
Yes, sir.
And that is correct, and you feel prepared for combat operations? Something flickered in Okonkwo's eyes. Not doubt, but something else, anticipation, maybe, sir. We have trained for this, and my soldiers are ready. The human company moved into their assigned sector with efficiency that impressed even Kwaishedi. Established defensive positions and set up fields of fire and coordinated with adjacent coalition units. They move well. The Veltorian battle mistress observed. Training has clearly instilled good tactical habits. The question is how they will perform under actual combat stress. Tren said they did not have to wait long to find out. The Kravax attacked Tarsus 9. 36 hours after the human company arrived. First warning came from long-range sensors detecting a massive swarm. Approaching from multiple vectors, alarms blared throughout the outpost and coalition. Forces moved to defensive stations following well-rehearsed protocols. Vexler watched from the command center as tactical displays lit up with incoming contacts. Estimated enemy strength is 40,000 units. The Antherian tactical officer reported. They are approaching in 3 primary waves with flanking elements attempting to encircle the outpost. All defensive sectors report ready. Another officer added, except Sector 7, the human sector. Lieutenant Okonkwo, what is your status? Vexler opened a communication channel. Sector 7 ready for defensive operations, sir? Came the reply, we are establishing firing positions now. But then, Okonkwo added something that made Vexler's optical sensors widen. Request permission to conduct forward reconnaissance and force negative. Lieutenant, you are to hold your defensive position. Understood, sir. Holding position. The Kravax struck with their usual overwhelming coordination, thousands, allowing them to execute complex maneuvers. With perfect synchronization, coalition forces opened fire with disciplined volleys and established killing zones and called for artillery. Support standard defensive doctrine textbook response. Then Sector 7 went completely off script. Commander, we have human forces advancing beyond their defensive perimeter. A tactical officer reported with confusion in their voice. Vexler pulled up the tactical feed from Sector 7 and felt something like horror wash over him. The humans were attacking, not just holding their line or conducting limited counterattacks. They were advancing directly into the Kravax swarm. Lieutenant Okonkwo, what are you doing? Vexler demanded over the command channel. Engaging the enemy, sir. Okonkwo replied, and behind his voice was the unmistakable sound of weapons fire. You were ordered to hold your position with respect. In disbelief as the human company charged forward into overwhelming numbers, they moved in coordinated fire teams and used suppressive fire in covering movements, just like in training. But this was not training. This was real combat against an enemy that had defeated veteran coalition forces across 12 sectors. They are going to be slaughtered, Trent said quietly, but that was not what happened. Kravax had evolved their tactics to counter coalition defensive strategies, excelled at surrounding static positions and overwhelming them with superior numbers and coordination. They had never faced an enemy that attacked them. The humans hit the Kravax front line like a hammer there. Weapons tore through biomechanical armor. At close range, they used explosives to create gaps in the enemy formation and then poured through those gaps. Before the hive mind could adapt, when ammunition ran low, they switched to blade weapons. Weapons broke. They used their hands. This is insane. Quisha whispered, but her tone carried something other than horror. It carried awe. The tactical display showed the human advance cutting deep into the Kravax formation behind them. Coalition forces in adjacent sectors began to rally. If The humans could attack, maybe they could, to all sectors advance and support the human breakthrough? The Antharian commander ordered for the first time in 18 months of warfare. Coalition forces were not just defending. They were attacking, and the Kravax did not know how to respond. Their hive mind had evolved tactics for overwhelming defensive positions but aggressive close quarters combat from multiple directions created chaos in their coordination. Individual Kravax warriors were formidable, but the collective intelligence that made them so dangerous began to fragment under the unexpected. Assault Vexel watched as Lieutenant Okonkwo led his soldiers deeper into enemy territory. The human officer was covered in gore from close combat, but still giving orders and coordinating fire teams. Second squad suppressing fire on that cluster, and third squad flank left, and everyone keep moving forward. A Kravax warrior larger than the others charged directly at Okonkwo. Human officer dodged the first strike and put 3 rounds into the creature's center mass, and when it kept coming, he drew a blade and engaged it in close combat. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. Okonkwo 1 status report. Vexler demanded, trying to keep track of the chaotic battle. Sector 7 reports 38% casualties. A tactical officer responded, they are requesting ammunition resupply but maintaining forward momentum. 38% casualties by Coalition standards. That would mean immediate retreat in unit dissolution. By human standards, it apparently meant keep attacking medical teams to Sector 7 immediately. Vexler ordered, and get them ammunition. The battle raged for 3 more hours. The humans took horrific casualties but never stopped advancing there. Training had conditioned them to push through pain and exhaustion. Inferno, they were doing exactly that in actual combat against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. When the Kravax finally broke, it was like watching a tidal wave reverse course. The mind collective intelligence that had made them so effective became a liability as panic spread through their ranks. They'd encountered something they could not adapt to. Prey that hunted back, the swarm began to retreat, and then the retreat became a rout. Coalition forces pursued them beyond the outpost perimeter and destroyed thousands of Kravax warriors who were too disorganized to mount effective resistance. When the shooting finally stopped, Vexler made his way to Sector 7. The scene was devastating. Ground was covered in Kravax corpses, and human bodies. Medical teams worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers sat against walls with blank 1,000-yard stares. Lieutenant Okonkwo was still on his feet, though he was bleeding from at least 3 visible wounds. Lieutenant, you need medical attention. Vexler said, after my people are taken care of, sir. Okonkwo replied, I am still combat effective, Sergeant Major. Santos appeared from somewhere and immediately began organizing casualty collection and ammunition distribution. Final count, Lieutenant. She ordered. Okonkwo consulted his datapad with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline crash. Started with 187 soldiers and 74 KIA and 41 wounded seriously, enough to require medical evacuation, and 32 walking wounded. 147 casualties out of 187 soldiers, nearly 80%, and you consider this acceptable? Vexler asked, though he thought he knew the answer. We held the line, sir, Okonkwo said. Actually, we pushed the line forward, and the Kravax are retreating for the first time anyone can remember. I would say that is more than acceptable. Santos put a hand on Okonkwo's shoulder. Good work, Lieutenant, and now get yourself to medical before you bleed out. As Okonkwo walked away, Vexler turned to Santos. Your soldiers fought well. They fought like we trained them to fight. Santos replied, aggressive and relentless and unwilling to quit, even when tactically they should have. The Kravax were not prepared for that. Over the next several days, as the outpost recovered from the battle, Vexler interviewed survivors from the human company. Every single one of them had been terrified during the fighting. They described fear like they had never experienced before. Well, they had pushed through it because that was what training had taught them to do. A young soldier named Private Chen explained it simply. I wanted to run away, sir, in every instinct I had was screaming at me to find cover and hide, but then I remembered what Sergeant Diaz told us during basic training. Fear is just chemicals in your brain, and you can feel fear and still act. So I kept shooting and kept moving and kept fighting. Quasia spent time studying the human combat tactics and comparing them to Veltorian warrior doctrine. They fight like berserkers. she told Vexler. The emergency session of the Galactic Defense. Coalition convened exactly 1 week after the Battle of Tarses 9 in every major. Species representative was present either physically or via holographic projection. Commander Vexler stood at the central podium with his 4 optical sensors scanning the assembled delegates. His report had been distributed beforehand, but now he had to present his findings and defend his conclusions. Honorable delegates, I have completed my evaluation of human military capabilities. He began. My team observed their training methods and interviewed their military personnel and witnessed them in actual combat against Kravax forces. What we discovered has profound implications for this war. High Chancellor Mordok gestured for him to continue. Present your findings, Commander. Vexler pulled up holographic displays showing footage from Camp Mackenzie, though. Delegates watched in silence as human recruits endured what looked like systematic torture obstacle courses designed to injure chemical weapons, exposure, live fire exercises with minimal safety margins. Human basic military training has a casualty rate of approximately 15% for injuries and an additional 0.5% fatality rate. Vexler reported by coalition standards, these numbers would be considered criminal negligence. By human standards, they are considered acceptable preparation for combat. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. This is barbaric. One delegate said they are torturing their own species. Another added. Vexler held up one of his primary appendages for silence. That was my initial assessment as well, and however I must present the complete picture. The holographic display shifted to footage from Tarsus 9. The delegates watched as the human company charged into overwhelming Kravax numbers. They saw soldiers fighting with broken weapons and wounded bodies and absolute determination. They saw the Kravax retreat for the first time in the war. The human company at Tarsus 9 sustained 78% casualties. Vexler continued. 147 soldiers killed or wounded out of 187, yet they achieved a decisive tactical victory and forced the Kravax to retreat, potentially saved the entire outpost from being overrun. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Battle Mistress Quasia stepped forward. I observed the battle personally, and the humans fought like nothing I have seen in 43 engagements. They did not fight to survive, and they had fought to win. There is a difference, Ambassador. Taleth raised an objection. But at what cost? And 78% casualties in a single engagement is unsustainable. And if we integrate human forces, are we simply feeding soldiers into a grinder? Is a valid concern. Vexler acknowledged, however, humans appear to have accounted for this in their military planning. He pulled up demographic data on human civilization. Earth has a population of approximately 9 billion individuals, in their military recruitment and training infrastructure can process millions of new soldiers annually. They have designed their entire society to sustain long-term warfare. Subcommander Tren added his analysis. The Kravax have been winning this war through attrition, and they overwhelm defensive positions with superior numbers and coordination. Human tactics directly counter this advantage. By being even more aggressive than the Kravax, and by accepting casualties that would break other species from a purely tactical perspective, they are effective. The question is whether we are willing to accept their methods. The debate raged for hours. Some delegates argued that integrating humans would fundamentally compromise coalition values. Others pointed out that losing the war would compromise those values even more permanently. Tactical analyst Zephyrim presented statistical projections based on human combat effectiveness at Tarses. Neon integration of human forces could shift the overall war probability in our favor. However, this assumes we can coordinate human aggression with coalition defensive doctrine. Failure to do so could result in friendly fire incidents and tactical confusion and wasted human lives. Vexler listened to all the arguments and then requested permission to speak again. Honorable delegates, I understand the concerns about human methods, and I share many of them, but I have spent weeks observing these people, and I have learned something important. He pulled up footage of human soldiers during downtime between training exercises. They were laughing and sharing meals and looking after wounded comrades. Humans are not mindless weapons, despite what their training might suggest, and they care deeply for each other. And they form bonds through shared suffering that are stronger than anything I have observed in other species. Their dark humor and their aggressive tactics and their acceptance of casualties all serve a purpose they are not trying to create. Perfect soldiers, and they are trying to create survivors, Sergeant Major Santos had provided Vexler with historical data on human warfare, and he shared it now. Humans have been fighting wars for their entire recorded history, and they have learned through bitter experience what works and what does not. Their training methods evolved over thousands of years of conflict. They are harsh because harsh training produces soldiers who survive harsh combat. It is that simple and that complicated. High Chancellor Mordok raised his primary appendage. Commander Vexler, what is your recommendation? This was the moment Vexler had been dreading and anticipating. I recommend full integration of human military forces into coalition operations with the following conditions. First, human units should operate semi-independently, under their own command structure while coordinating with coalition tactical planning. Second, we should study human training methods to identify elements that could improve coalition military effectiveness without compromising our values. Third, we should prepare for the psychological impact of working alongside soldiers who approach warfare fundamentally differently than we do. He paused and met the gaze of as many delegates as his optical sensors could track. Honorable delegates, the humans terrify me, and their methods horrify me, and their casualty rates are unconscionable by our standards. But they are winning, and right now we are losing. Would rather have humans fighting beside us than continue losing to the Kravax. The vote was called. It was not unanimous, but the motion passed. Galactic Defense Coalition would integrate human military forces into their war effort after the session ended. Vexler found himself approached by several delegates who wanted more details about the humans. Some were clearly still skeptical, others were cautiously optimistic. A few looked as terrified as Vexler felt. Sergeant Major Santos had watched the proceedings via remote feed. Congratulations, Commander, she said when Vexler contacted her. Your people have officially joined our war effort. I am not sure if congratulations are appropriate, Vexler replied, but thank you, and I hope we are making the right decision. So do I, Commander, and so do I. Santos was promoted to Colonel and given a new assignment. She would be developing a modified training program to help coalition species improve their combat readiness while respecting their different biological and cultural limitations. I will do my best, she told Vexler during their final meeting, though. I suspect most species will find even a watered-down version of our training quite intense. That may be exactly what they need, Vexler said. Over the following months, human military forces began deploying throughout coalition space. They were integrated carefully with experienced coalition units providing coordination in humans, providing aggressive shock tactics. The results were immediate and dramatic battles that would have been defensive stalemates turned into coalition victories. Skravox advances were not just stopped, but reversed. Human casualties remained high, but the soldiers kept coming. Earth's recruitment centers worked around the clock, processing volunteers who wanted to fight. Word of human combat effectiveness spread through both coalition and Kravax forces. Coalition soldiers learned that humans would never abandon their allies. If you fought alongside humans, you fought alongside warriors who would die before they retreated. The Kravax learned something different. They learned that humans were persistence hunters who evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and the Kravax had become the prey. 6 months after integration, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. The Kravax were no longer advancing. They were fortifying existing positions and preparing defenses and acting more cautiously. For the first time since the war began, they seemed afraid of Vexler. Reviewed battle reports from across the front lines. Human units were taking devastating casualties, but achieving objectives that had seemed impossible. Coalition forces were learning from human tactics, not adopting them wholesale, but incorporating elements of human aggression into their own doctrine. The war was far from over, but it was no longer a slow march toward inevitable defeat. He received a message from Lieutenant Okonkwo, who had been promoted to captain after Tarsus 9. Commander Vexler, I wanted to thank you for Giving us a chance to prove ourselves, my new company is preparing to deploy to the Antares sector, and we are looking forward to showing the Kravax what humans can do. Bexler replied with genuine warmth. Captain Okonkwo, you and your soldiers have already proven yourselves many times over and fight well and tried to come back alive. We'll do our best, sir, and though I should mention that coming back alive is a bonus and completing the mission is the requirement.